The storm-lit night pressed against the rusted cage where a tiny lion cub lay trembling, its breath shallow, its eyes clouded with fear. The little girl stood before it, soaked to the bone, gripping the chain lock with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Behind her, the crunch of approaching footsteps cut through the rain. The poachers were coming back. She'd swallowed hard, knowing she had only seconds left to choose between safety and saving a life. Seeing the cub lift its weak paw toward her, I felt a tightness in my chest, as if it were reaching for me too. In that instant, everything changed. The morning sun often washed over the small village at the edge of the reserve, turning the dry earth into a sheet of gold. Here, in a modest clay-walled home, lived the 10-year-old girl whose life had always been intertwined with the rhythms of the wild. She was small for her age, with an earnest gaze and a quiet determination that adults often mistook for timidity. But anyone who truly knew her understood that beneath her gentle exterior lived a heart that felt too deeply, especially for animals that could not speak for themselves. Her parents worked long hours at the reserve's maintenance outpost, and she spent her days wandering the paths where savannah met village. She loved listening to the distant calls of wildlife, imagining what each cry meant, what the creatures felt, what stories they carried inside them. Ever since she had lost her beloved dog a year earlier, she had become even more sensitive to suffering. Watching the dog struggle in its final days had carved a wound inside her, one that made her vow that no creature around her would ever face pain alone if she could help it. I still remember how raw that loss felt. Moments like that leave an imprint that never truly fades. Her world was shaped by contrasts, breathtaking beauty and lurking danger, innocence and harsh reality, wonder and fear. The locals often warned children not to wander too far, especially with poachers rumored to be setting traps deeper in the reserve. Yet despite the warnings, her compassion made her brave, sometimes too brave. She carried a small worn notebook where she documented every injured bird, limping antelope, or abandoned nest she encountered. Her dream was to one day become a wildlife caretaker, someone who could mend what cruelty had broken. One afternoon, as she walked along a familiar trail lined with acacia trees, she noticed an unsettling silence. The usual chorus of birds had dimmed, and even the breeze felt still, as if holding its breath. She paused, scanning the brush, sensing something was amiss. That tension in the air made her wonder how many hidden stories of struggle existed beyond what her young eyes could see. The days leading up to the storm had grown increasingly uneasy. Her father mentioned that rangers had found footprints from suspected poachers. Her insisted insisted that she stay closer to home until things settled. But worry tugged at her, the kind that sits heavy on the chest without explanation. She felt, in an instinctive way children sometimes do, that something was about to happen, something that would test who she was and what she believed in. She didn't know it yet, but destiny was already drawing her toward the rusted cage she would find on that stormy night. And as I think back on that moment, I realize how every quiet day before it had been preparing her for a choice bigger than herself. I couldn't have known where her path would lead, but something told me her life was about to change in ways she could never imagine. The forest path she followed that afternoon was one she had walked 100 times before, yet something felt different. The air was thick, as if the world were holding its breath. She stepped carefully over the tangled roots and dry grass, her senses sharpened by uneasiness she couldn't explain. The silence grew heavier the farther she ventured, until even the buzzing insects seemed to fade away. Then she heard it, so faint she almost missed it, a trembling whimper carried on the wind. She froze. The sound came again, a soft, pained cry that made her heart drop. She pushed through a curtain of bushes, her pulse quickening. There, hidden beneath branches and half covered by leaves, stood a rusted metal cage. Its bars were bent and weathered, but still strong enough to hold whatever was trapped inside. She moved closer, holding her breath, and then she saw it. A lion cub, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, curled against the far corner of the cage. Its golden fur was matted with dirt, and one of its hind legs was twisted unnaturally beneath its body. Every breath it took seemed like a battle, a shallow rise and fall that barely stirred its tiny chest. Its eyes, wide, dark, and glistening with fear, locked onto hers. In that moment, everything around her blurred. I remember feeling a sharp ache in my chest, reading about that look. There's something about a young creature in pain that reaches a place inside you that you didn't know was vulnerable. She knelt slowly, trying not to startle it. The cub flinched, letting out a weak growl that dissolved into a whimper. It was terrified, but more than that, it was exhausted. The cage had been hastily concealed, branches deliberately dragged to hide its presence. She recognized what this meant even before the realization fully settled in. Poachers! The very threat the villagers feared had come closer than anyone expected. Her hands trembled as she inspected the cage. The padlock was old but secure. She tugged at it, testing its strength, but it wouldn't budge. She looked around, hoping desperately for someone to appear, a ranger, a villager, anyone who could help. But the forest remained still. For a moment, fear swept over her. What if the poachers returned? What if they were watching right now? The cub let out another helpless cry, and she felt her fear shift into something fiercer, something braver. She slid her fingers through the bars, inching closer. The cub hesitated, then rested its head lightly against her hand, as if surrendering to the only kindness it had left. Seeing it trust her, even for a second, made me wonder how a creature so young could still find the strength to hope. She pulled her hand back and scanned the area for tools, anything that could break the lock. A broken branch, a jagged rock, even a piece of old wire. She found nothing strong enough. The seconds felt heavy, each one a reminder that time was slipping away. A gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying the faint echo of distant voices. She stiffened. They were too far to make out clearly, but she knew with chilling certainty what they were. The poachers returning for their prize. She felt her pulse hammer against her ribs as her mind raced. She couldn't leave the cub, but staying meant risking everything. She crouched beside the cage once more, whispering softly to the trembling cub, as if trying to reassure them both. At that moment, she realized she had already made her decision long before fear tried to change her mind. And as I think about that moment, it becomes clear to me that courage often begins long before we recognize it in ourselves. The first drops of rain began to fall as she pressed her back against the cage, trying to steady her breathing. The sky above the treetops darkened into a heavy bruise, thunder rumbling in the distance like a warning she couldn't ignore. The cub whimpered again, its voice thin and trembling, and she felt the sound pull her forward even as fear urged her to run. She wrapped her fingers around the cold bars, whispering softly to it, as if her voice alone might shield it from what was coming. The distant voices grew louder. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, men calling to one another, confident and careless, unaware that their trap had been discovered. Her pulse raced. She looked around desperately for anything she could use. Her gaze landed on a fallen tree limb, thick but cracked along one side. She dragged it toward the cage, lifting it with all the strength her small frame could muster. Her arms shook under the weight, but she raised it high and swung down onto the padlock. The metal rattled violently but didn't break. She struck again, teeth clenched, rain soaking her hair and face. The second blow cracked the branch instead. She stumbled forward, dropping the splintered wood. The cub pressed itself tighter into the corner, startled by the noise. She knelt beside it, forcing her voice to stay calm, even as her heart felt like it was beating too fast to breathe. She had never felt so torn, so desperate to save something while knowing she might not be enough. Another thunderclap split the sky. She saw a glint of something half buried in the mud near the roots of a tree, a rusted metal stake, likely discarded by loggers long ago. She scrambled to it, dug it free, and hurried back. It wasn't much, but it was solid. She jammed the stake beneath the lock and pushed down with everything she had. The rain made her hand slip, but she tightened her grip, her muscles burning. The padlock bent slightly, just enough to give her hope. She pushed harder, straining until her shoulders shook. For a moment, she thought nothing would happen. Then, with a harsh metallic snap, the lock gave way and clattered to the ground. The door creaked open a few inches, its hinges stiff from years of neglect. The cub's ears perked at the sound, its eyes wide with confusion and fear. She pulled the door open farther, motioning for the cub to come. But it didn't move. Its injured leg trembled when it tried to shift its weight, and the effort sent it collapsing onto its side. Rainwater dripped from its whiskers, mixing with the dirt on its muzzle. Watching it struggle like that made my throat tighten. There's something deeply human about the way suffering looks when it's silent and small. She lifted the cub gently, sliding one arm under its chest and the other beneath its hindquarters. It was heavier than she expected, its soft fur slick from the rain, but she held it close and staggered toward the tree line. She didn't know where she would go, only that she had to get away from the voices drawing nearer. Her breath came in sharp bursts as she half carried, half dragged the cub through the underbrush. Branches whipped against her legs. Mud swallowed her steps. The cub whimpered every time she stumbled. She whispered apologies into its fur, tightening her grip each time its body trembled. Behind them, the poachers' voices rose with alarm. They had discovered the broken lock. Lightning flashed, illuminating the forest in a white, trembling glow. She spotted a narrow trail leading downhill toward a shallow ravine. She hurried toward it, slipping, catching herself, moving forward again. The poachers were close enough now that she could hear their footsteps pounding against the wet earth. Her heart hammered as she pushed through a curtain of vines and half slid down the ravine slope. At the bottom, a thin stream cut through the mud, rushing with fresh rainwater. She crouched behind a fallen tree trunk, clutching the cub to her chest as breath tore from her lungs. The voices reached the edge of the ravine, arguing, cursing, searching. She held still, barely daring to inhale. The cub pressed its head weakly beneath her chin, its body shivering against hers. That small gesture, seeking comfort when it had every reason to fear, made me wonder how trust can take root even in the harshest moments. The voices eventually faded, swallowed by the storm. She stayed hidden until the world settled into the steady rhythm of rainfall. Only then did she loosen her hold on the cub, smoothing the wet fur along its spine. She looked at the ravine stretching ahead, uncertain and wild, but she understood what she had to do. This was only the beginning. And as I reflect on that night, it strikes me that sometimes the bravest decisions are made not when we feel strong, but when we're terrified and choose to act anyway. The storm had weakened by the time she reached the old abandoned shelter deep within the reserve. It was a forgotten structure, once used by rangers decades ago, now little more than cracked walls and a sagging roof half swallowed by vines. But to her, in that moment, it was the only safe place she could think of. She pushed the door open with her shoulder, carrying the lion cub inside, her arms trembling from effort and fear. The interior smelled of dust and old wood, but it was dry. She laid the cub carefully on a pile of discarded canvas sacks, trying to cushion its injured leg. The cub whimpered softly, its voice thin but present. She knelt beside it, brushing wet strands of hair from her face as she tried to steady her breathing. The adrenaline that had driven her through the storm was fading, leaving her shaken and exhausted. Yet every time the cub opened its eyes to look at her, she felt something inside her grow steadier, stronger. She searched the shelter for anything useful. In a rusted locker, she found a torn blanket, a metal cup, and a bottle of antiseptic so old she hesitated before opening it. Still, it was better than nothing. She poured a small amount onto a cloth and gently dabbed at the cub's wounds. It flinched, teeth baring for a moment, before its strength failed again. She whispered softly, letting her voice soothe what her hands could not. Watching her work with such care made me think about how some people are born with a tenderness the world cannot easily teach. She examined the twisted hind leg next. The injury wasn't clean. It looked like the cub had been caught in a trap before being forced into the cage. She winced at the deep cut. The swelling, the way the cub held its breath as if bracing for pain. Carefully, she cleaned the wound and wrapped it with strips torn from the old blanket. The cub's breathing slowed, its eyes fluttering as exhaustion pulled it toward sleep. Outside, the storm rumbled quietly, the worst of it drifting away. She sat beside the cub, pulling the remaining blanket around her shoulders. Her clothes were still damp, and the cold began to seep in, but she refused to leave its side. She watched the rise and fall of its chest, feeling its fragile warmth. In the dim light, she noticed how small it truly was, how young. It wasn't just an animal caught in danger. It was a child of the wild, alone and suffering. The realization made her throat tighten. Hours passed. She dozed lightly, waking at every movement the cub made. When dawn finally broke, soft light filtered through the cracked roof, casting gentle stripes across the shelter. The cub opened its eyes, blinking slowly, and let out a tiny rumble that almost sounded like a greeting. She smiled for the first time since the storm. She placed her hand near its head, waiting to see if it would accept the touch. The cub leaned into her palm, letting out a fragile purr. That moment, small, quiet, and utterly sincere, felt like the beginning of something she couldn't yet name. A bond was forming, one built from fear, trust, and the fragile hope that both of them were still trying to understand. Seeing that tiny spark of connection made me realize how healing often begins not with medicine, but with kindness. Over the next few days, she dedicated herself entirely to the cub's recovery. She snuck food from home, small scraps of cooked meat wrapped in cloth, and carried water from a nearby stream. Each visit felt dangerous. If anyone saw her, questions would follow, and questions would lead to consequences she wasn't ready to face. But the cub needed her. That was enough. As the cub's strength returned, its personality began to show. It tried to stand on 3 legs, wobbling awkwardly before collapsing into her lap. It batted at her shoelaces with clumsy paws. It followed her with its eyes every time she moved, as if afraid she might disappear. Each tiny victory filled her with pride. Each setback made her worry more deeply than she ever had for herself. But with every passing day, the two of them grew more connected. She talked to the cub about everything, her dreams, her fears, the stories she used to tell her dog when she was younger, and though the cub could not understand her words, it understood her presence. Its trust deepened with every hour she stayed by its side. By the end of the week, the cub's purrs grew stronger, its eyes brighter. It nudged her hand whenever she paused, as if reminding her it was still there, still fighting. Watching them together, I couldn't help but feel that their lives were weaving into one another in a way neither of them could undo. As she leaned against the shelter wall that evening, listening to the cub breathing steadily beside her, she sensed something quietly powerful settling between them. A promise formed without words, born from survival and tenderness. And in that stillness, she understood that nothing about her life would ever be the same again. For more than a week, the hidden shelter had become a world of its own, a fragile sanctuary where fear softened into trust and survival grew into companionship. Each morning, before the sun fully rose, she slipped out of her home with careful steps, carrying scraps of food wrapped in cloth. Each evening, she returned to the cub with stories about her day, her voice a soft thread weaving their two lives closer together. But secrets, no matter how deeply tucked away, have a way of rising to the surface. That morning started like any other. She hurried along the narrow path, heart light, with the thought of seeing the cub's brightening eyes and hearing its soft purrs. The birds were louder than usual, calling from every branch, and for a moment she let herself feel peaceful. Yet even peace can become a warning in disguise. When the forest is too lively, it reveals how silent it had been before. She reached the shelter and pushed the door open. The cub lifted its head and chirped a tiny greeting, its injured leg still bandaged but healing. She smiled, the tension of the morning fading instantly. She knelt beside it, offering small pieces of meat, laughing quietly as the cub nudged her hand, impatient and hungry. Watching the two of them like that, the girl and the lion cub sharing a moment so innocent, I felt a warmth in my chest, the kind that reminds you why compassion is one of the purest instincts we have. She didn't hear the footsteps at first. It wasn't until a shadow moved across the doorway that her body went rigid. She turned slowly, dread curling into her stomach. Her mother stood at the entrance. Rain-damp hair clung to her mother's forehead, and her eyes, wide, disbelieving, fell upon the lion cub sprawled across the canvas sacks. For a moment, she didn't speak. She simply stared, her expression shifting from confusion to horror, then to something sharper, fear for her child. "What have you done?" her mother whispered, her voice trembling. The girl opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her mind raced, replaying every step she had taken, every lie of omission, every quiet moment she had believed she was safe. The cub let out a small sound, sensing the tension, and attempted to push itself closer to her. Her mother stepped forward quickly. "Move away from it." "No," the girl said, finding her voice at last. It came out small but steady. "It needs me." "It's a wild animal," her mother insisted. "You could have been killed." "If the rangers find out, if your father finds out—" The girl shook her head, tears burning her eyes. "I couldn't leave it there. It would have died." Her mother's anger faltered, replaced by something softer, something painfully conflicted. She knelt, studying the cub's injuries, the careful bandages, the girl's trembling hands. The truth of her daughter's devotion lay in every detail. For a moment, neither spoke, and watching that silence unfold made me wonder how many difficult choices begin with love and end in fear. Her mother finally let out a breath. "We can't keep this a secret any longer." Those words hit harder than she expected. The shelter suddenly felt smaller, as though the walls themselves were closing in. She knew her mother was right. The cub needed real care. A ranger, a veterinarian, someone who could help it survive in the wild. But giving it up felt like tearing a piece of herself away. Her mother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We'll do this together," she said, "but you need to be brave." The girl wiped her eyes, looking down at the cub nestled against her leg. The cub blinked up at her, trusting her completely, unaware that trust wasn't enough to keep the world from changing. And in that moment, she understood that even the strongest bonds can be tested by the truth, and sometimes doing the right thing feels unbearably heavy. Years passed, moving with a quiet inevitability that softened the edges of childhood memories. The girl, now a young woman, had grown taller, stronger, and wiser, but there were moments when she still felt like the child who had once raced through the storm carrying a wounded lion cub in her arms. Life had carried her forward, but the memory of that cub never stopped following behind, like a shadow stitched gently to her heart. Her family eventually transferred to a town farther from the reserve, and though she understood the reasons, safer schools, better work, a quieter life, part of her ached for what she had left behind. The cub had been taken into the hands of skilled wildlife caretakers, and she had watched it go with tears, carving silent paths down her cheeks. She never forgot the way it had pressed its head into her palm one last time, as if memorizing her scent. Even years later, she could still feel that weight against her skin. Time has a way of dulling some memories, but others sharpen instead, etched deeper with each passing season. For her, the cub belonged to the latter, and thinking about how strongly that memory stayed with her made me realize how love, even in its briefest form, can anchor itself to a lifetime. By the time she turned 18, she knew exactly what she wanted. She applied to join a wildlife volunteer program near the same reserve she had once called home. When her acceptance letter arrived, she held it between trembling fingers, feeling a rush of anticipation so intense it bordered on fear. Returning to the place where everything had changed felt like stepping into a long-forgotten dream. The reserve had grown since she last saw it. New fences lined the perimeter, watchtowers stood taller, and wide dirt paths had been carved through the trees to help rangers navigate more quickly. But the smell of the air, the wild, sun-baked earth mixed with the faint sweetness of acacia blossoms, had not changed at all. The familiarity wrapped around her like an embrace she had been missing for years. Her first week was filled with training, learning safety protocols, shadowing rangers, cataloging animal behavior. But on the seventh day, something unusual happened. A senior ranger asked her to accompany him to the northern clearing, where a lone male lion had been spotted wandering near the patrol routes. The lion was large, he said, larger than most, and displayed unusually calm behavior around humans. They needed to observe it, document its condition, and determine whether intervention was necessary. She rode in the back of the jeep, heart steady at first, until they reached the clearing. There, standing in the open grass, was a massive lion. Its mane was thick and golden, rippling gently with the wind. Muscles shaped its powerful frame, and scars ran along its hind leg, scars faint but familiar. The lion lifted its head slowly, as though sensing something beyond sight. Its amber eyes swept across the clearing, landing on her with a stillness so intense she forgot how to breathe. A strange warmth bloomed in her chest. She stepped down from the jeep, without meaning to, drawn forward by something magnetic and old. The ranger reached for her arm, startled. "Be careful!" he warned. "A lion that size—" But she barely heard him. The lion took a single step toward her, then another. Its eyes held hers, not with the predatory focus of a wild beast, but with recognition. Deep, steady, unmistakable recognition. My heart tightened, reading that moment. Sometimes reality offers a connection so profound it challenges everything we believe about instinct and memory. She continued forward, her breaths shallow, her hands trembling. The wind rustled the grass around them, carrying the distant cries of birds, but the world felt utterly silent. With slow, deliberate movements, the lion approached until only a few feet separated them. Then, in an act that left the ranger speechless, the lion lowered its great head and bowed. She felt her vision blur. A flood of memories, storms, shelters, wounds, whispered stories rushed back, each one tightening the thread that still bound them. She lifted a hand, hesitated, then placed it gently on the lion's mane. The lion closed its eyes, leaning into her touch with a patience and tenderness no one could have expected. It was a reunion so improbable that it would have sounded like fiction to anyone else. Yet here it unfolded, raw and real. She knelt in the grass, burying her fingers in the thick mane. "You remember," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You really remember." And in that unforgettable stillness, she realized something powerful. Some bonds don't weaken with time. They wait, quietly enduring until the world brings them back together. The days that followed their reunion felt almost unreal. She spent every spare moment in the northern clearing, documenting the lion's behavior while quietly rediscovering the familiar echoes of their old bond. The other rangers were astonished by the lion's gentleness toward her, though none could explain it. They chalked it up to chance, to temperament, to anything within the realm of what they understood. But she knew better. The way he watched her with calm, knowing eyes felt like a silent conversation, one that had begun years ago and never truly ended. One afternoon, while the sun cast long shadows across the grasslands, she found herself walking alone near this boundary ridge. The air was warm and still, the kind of quiet that usually made her feel at peace. She stopped to take notes on a herd of antelope grazing nearby when a sharp crack echoed through the open space. It wasn't the sound of nature. It was man-made, precise, cold, unmistakable. A gunshot. Her body froze. Another shot followed, closer this time. The antelope scattered in a panic, kicking up clouds of dust as they fled. She glanced toward the ridge and saw them, 3 figures moving stealthily through the brush, rifles slung over their shoulders. Poachers! Their presence sent a chill rushing through her bloodstream. The reserve had been fighting illegal hunting for years, but encountering them this close felt like stepping into an old nightmare she thought she'd left behind. She backed away slowly, trying not to draw attention, but a twig snapped beneath her boot. One of the men jerked his head in her direction. Their eyes met across the distance, cold, assessing, dangerous. Her breath caught. She turned and ran. Branches whipped at her arms as she sprinted through the tall grass. Behind her, she heard shouts, heavy footsteps, the unmistakable sound of men giving chase. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, fear pulsed through her like electricity. She stumbled on a root and fell hard, dirt scraping her palms. She scrambled to her feet again, heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. She didn't know where she was running, only that she had to keep moving, but the poachers were closing in. One of them shouted, his voice sharp and triumphant, as if he could already feel victory tightening around her. She burst into a clearing and skidded to a stop. There was nowhere left to go. The ridge walls rose steeply to her left, and the brush behind her rustled violently as the men approached. Her chest tightened with helplessness. For a moment, she felt like the child she once was, cornered, afraid, painfully small in a world filled with danger. The poachers stepped into the clearing, rifles raised. She backed away, her legs trembling, her mind racing through 1,000 impossible thoughts. She opened her mouth to shout for help, though she knew no one was near enough to hear her. But someone was. A low, thunderous growl rolled across the clearing. The men froze. She turned toward the sound, her breath catching in her throat. Emerging from the tall grass, mane blazing like fire in the late light, was the lion. His eyes were fixed on the poachers, cold, fierce, protective. He stepped between her and the men with a confidence that shook the ground beneath him. The poachers raised their rifles instinctively, but the lion's roar shattered the air before they could act. It wasn't a warning. It was a declaration, a force of nature unleashed. The men stumbled back, terror flashing across their faces. One dropped his rifle, another tripped trying to flee. Within seconds, all 3 bolted into the brush, swallowed by panic and the pounding of their own footsteps. Silence settled slowly over the clearing. She felt her knees weaken. The lion turned to her, head lowering as he stepped closer. His mane brushed her arm as he nudged her gently, as if checking whether she was whole. That simple gesture, so tender, so intentional, made me wonder how deeply animals understand gratitude, loyalty, and the bonds forged in shared struggle. She pressed a trembling hand against his broad forehead, tears blurring her vision. "You saved me," she whispered, and in that moment she understood something she had always sensed but never fully realized. Sometimes love returns not just to be remembered, but to protect. The sun dipped low over the savannah, casting warm streaks of amber across the clearing where she stood beside the lion. Her heartbeat had finally begun to steady. though her legs still trembled from the shock of what had happened. The lion remained close, his presence grounding her as if reassuring her that the danger was truly gone. She rested a hand on his mane, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. Somehow, that rhythm felt like an anchor, pulling her back into herself. Rangers arrived minutes later, alerted by the distant gunshots and the sudden flight of wildlife across the plains. They approached cautiously, rifles lowered but ready, confusion written across their faces as they took in the scene. The young woman unharmed, the lion calm at her side, the trampled grass showing clear signs of pursuit. The head ranger stepped forward, his eyes narrowing at the lion in disbelief. "What happened here?" he asked. She swallowed, her voice catching slightly as she explained. She described the poachers, the chase, the clearing, and how the lion had appeared at the exact moment she needed him most. The rangers exchanged glances, some skeptical, others visibly moved, but none dared approach the lion who stood watch with unwavering focus. When she finished, the head ranger turned to her, his voice softer now. "It seems he remembers you," he said, "and you should know lions don't do this. Not for humans, not like this." Her gaze drifted to the lion, who looked back with the same quiet certainty that had filled his eyes the day he bowed his head in recognition. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, the same warmth she had felt years ago when she held him close in the storm-soaked shelter. I couldn't help but feel a similar swell inside me. Moments like these remind us that life's most extraordinary connections are often built in silence and tested in fire. The rangers secured the area and escorted her back to camp, while the lion followed at a distance, lingering at the edge of the tree line. He watched her until she crossed the final ridge, his silhouette framed by the fading sunlight. She turned one last time and lifted her hand. The lion lifted his head in acknowledgement before disappearing into the tall grass. In the days that followed, news of the encounter spread through the reserve. Volunteers whispered about the lion who had protected a human. Rangers debated the nature of animal memory, and researchers speculated about imprinting behaviors formed during infancy. But to her, none of the theories mattered. She knew what she had seen, what she had felt, and sometimes the truth of the heart doesn't need to be dissected to be real. She continued her work at the reserve, now with renewed purpose. Every patrol, every injured animal she documented, every conservation briefing she attended felt more meaningful. Saving the cub years ago had changed her life, but being saved by the lion had transformed something deeper. Her belief in the unseen threads that bind living beings together. Watching her lean into that purpose made me believe even more strongly that the world becomes gentler each time someone chooses compassion over fear. Weeks later, she returned to the northern clearing alone. The grass swayed in the breeze, whispering memories of the day she thought her life would end. She closed her eyes and breathed in the familiar scent of acacia and warm earth. When she opened them again, she saw him, standing at a distance, half hidden behind the tall grass. Their eyes met, and in that quiet moment, no words were needed. She stepped forward just once. The lion dipped his head, a brief greeting, a soft farewell, a promise renewed without sound or touch. She knew then that their lives would continue to move in different directions. His among the golden plains of the wild, hers along the winding road of conservation and care. But the bond they shared would remain, not tied by proximity, but by memory and meaning. As she walked away from the clearing, she felt a lightness in her chest, knowing she had witnessed a kind of love that defied explanation. And thinking back on everything, I realized that sometimes the most powerful lessons don't come from people at all, but from the quiet loyalty of a creature who never forgot the hands that once saved him.